Now that we have seen what CBS and ABC were offering on their Saturday morning lineups in the latter half of the 1980s, there was one more network that had to show and prove, that being NBC. The network was in a strange place during the earlier part of the decade. They were dead last in the ratings, but the latter half of the 1980s was a different story. By 1985, NBC had finally found themselves in a great position. This was all due to the contribution of Brandon Tartikoff. He would be responsible for bringing the network to the #1 spot, but that was prime time. How about Saturday mornings? Well, during the 1970s, their Saturday morning lineups was in a decent place, with Hanna-Barbera making up the bulk of their lineup. But in the latter half of the 1980s, their contribution was outweighed by other studios that came into the fold. Case in point, Ruby Spears Enterprises. They had came with Alvin and the Chipmunks in 1984, and by the end of 1989, the series was still one of the most watched programs on Saturday mornings. Their tenure on the network would bleed into the early 90s as the series format had changed, and it went from Alvin and the Chipmunks to the Chipmunks, and to its final incarnation, Alvin Goes to the Movies, an entire season based off movie spoofs starring the Chipmunks and the Chipettes. Also, the Smurfs held on to their spot as NBC's most watched cartoon series. But Brandon Tartikoff wasn't content on those shows being their only standout hits. There was only one obstacle that the network had to overcome. See, many of the shows that did great for them in the earlier part of the 1980s gone from the lineup, such as Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, The Incredible Hulk, Thundarr the Barbarian, The Flintstones Funnies, and Pink Panther and Sons, which migrated to ABC in the fall of 1985 as reruns. The network also managed to offer something very different for their lineup: a sitcom. No, it's not the one that you are thinking of. We will get to that one in a later time. Instead, the sitcom that I'm speaking of is a Hanna-Barbera production. Yes, Hanna-Barbera doing a live-action sitcom, Going Bananas. It starred an orangutan by the name of Roxana Banana. Yes, that was its name. What else did you expect her name to be? If you thought its name was cheesy, then the premise had it beaten. It had Roxana suddenly get superpowers from an alien spaceship, and with the help of her owners, James and Louise Cole, they went about stopping two crooks from nabbing our brave Simeon so they can use it for their nefarious deeds. Despite the series being created by Lynn Jansen and Chuck Menville, two men that were making waves on Saturday mornings with their writing prowess, including scripting several episodes of The Real Ghostbusters and having a theme song produced by the late, great Giorgio Moroder and vocals by Irene Cara, the same woman who sung the theme songs to Fame, Going Bananas, unfortunately, wasn't a hit. It only managed to get 12 episodes before it was axed. Speaking of being axed, this was commonplace on Saturday morning lineups, and NBC was no exception. As you will see, NBC would struggle to keep a series going beyond one season. Fortunately, the first series on Showcase wasn't one of them. In fact, this anime series was poised to change the fortunes of one prolific animation studio for the better. So what was the series? Well, throughout this episode, I have been mentioning a series that would be a huge hit for NBC around this time. The studio that was responsible for this series? Well, it was none other than Walt Disney Television Animation. You know, I think it's about time that we finally see what this animated series was. CBS had the Wuzzles, ABC had The New Adventures of Winnie the Pooh, and NBC had this.
Dashing close and caring, faithful and friendly, with stories to share. All through the forest they sing out in chorus, marching along as their song fills the air. Gummy bears bouncing here and there.
Finally, here it is, in all of its glory. I present to you Disney's Adventures of the Gummy Bears, but it was commonly referred to as the Gummy Bears. To truly understand the importance of this series had on the network's Saturday morning lineup and Disney establishing their presence in television animation, I must take it back to... This is the year that Disney would make significant changes, including bringing in a man that, beknownst to them, was going to change their fortunes for the better. This man was Michael Eisner. It wasn't exactly hard to see why he was a good fit for Disney. He previously had gotten his start at NBC and CBS before finally getting a huge break at ABC, where he served as an assistant to the program director at the company. Michael soon moved up their ranks as he became a senior vice president in charge of programming and development. He was instrumental in bringing top shows of the time, such as Barney Miller, Happy Days, and Roots. In 1976, he got his biggest break in the industry. He was hired by Paramount to become their president after Barry Diller became their chairman 2 years prior in 1974. Eisner led the studio to great success. Under his tenure, and Diller's of course, the studio churned out classic films such as Raiders of the Lost Ark, Terms of Endearment, the Star Trek films, Beverly Hills Cop, and Grease, to name a few. When Barry Diller went on to other things away from Paramount in 1984, Eisner was expected to follow in his footsteps, taking the chairman position. But this wouldn't be the case. Instead, Disney came to him with a better proposition: to make him the chairman and CEO of the Walt Disney Company. The rest is history. Well, later on in his 21-year tenure at the company, of course. But speaking in the context of 1984, Eisner wanted to change how Disney were perceived in the eyes of the public and take them to new heights. This included getting rid of the company's edict of not making animation for television. He felt that this was the right move for the company going forward. As we know by now, Disney television animation was soon established after his arrival at the company. Eisner had many ideas for the new studio, but none of them included bringing Mickey Mouse to television, as he felt he was too special for it. Instead, he wanted to create new IPs to establish their presence on television. As we know by now, their first project was The Wuzzles. But that's not entirely accurate. See, there was another project that was being worked on at the same time as The Wuzzles. A project that got started because one of Eisner's children had requested a new candy that was making waves: gummy bears. It was a eureka moment for Eisner upon seeing them. So he rounded up his new staff, including Jim Magin and Art Vitello, whom would serve as creator and director of this new project respectively. Eisner wanted them to make a cartoon based on this gelatinous confectionery. In other words, Art and Jim had their work cut out for them. Early in the planning stages for this project, Jim shot a couple of ideas at Eisner, including making a series based on Candyland and having a villain called Licorice Whip and his sidekick Scummy Gummy. Eisner wasn't pleased with the idea, or as Jim once stated on the Great Beautiful podcast in 2016, he's crazy. That's how the process went. They both thought that his idea of turning a candy into an animated series was too weird for their taste. But they had to do something to appease their new boss. They would eventually figure out what was needed for the series. That was taking inspiration from J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Ring novels and giving the series a medieval theme. Jim once stated that the team were thinking of Disney classic films such as Sleeping Beauty and Snow White, as it was the safest route to go. Considering this was their very first time creating an anime series from scratch, so knights and castles crept into the development of the series. Their diligent work would pay off, and the end result was The Adventures of the Gummy Bears. Making its premiere on the same exact day as the Wuzzles, the series had taken on a very Tolkien-esque vibe and storytelling as it was set in the medieval kingdom of Dunwin, a kingdom governed over by the kind but very stern King Gregor. When he wasn't tending to his kingly duties, he had his daughter to raise, the rambunctious and very adventurous-minded Princess Calla. Residing in the outskirts of the kingdom lied a forest that was vast and secretly housed a race of anthropomorphic bears known as the Gummies. Secretly living underground in Gummy Glen, connected by several tunnels, the Gummies, once thought to be a myth, had hid from mankind after being persecuted by them many years prior. They were indeed real. The clan consisted of Gruffy Gummy, the patriarch that also served as a mechanic fixing anything around Gummy Glen. He was a very skilled craftsman and occasionally in a great mood. Then you had Grammy Gummy, voiced by the late, great June Foray. She was the matriarch and the only one who knew how to make gummy berry juice, a drink that was passed down to generations. This particular juice gave them a special power, the ability to bounce. Grammy was also seen butting heads with Gruffy due to his stubborn ways. Then you had Zummy Gummy, voiced by Paul Winchell and later by Jim Cummins, who previously voiced Tigger and Winnie the Pooh respectively. He was the older, wiser Gummy that had a knack for magic and deciphers the great book of Gummy, learning the spells contained inside it. He was constantly messing up on the spells and pronouncing words wrong as well. Then there's Cubby Gummy, the youngest of the clan that dreamed of being a knight and even donned a mask to satiate his thirst for adventure. But that same thirst also got him into loads of trouble. Then there was Sunny Gummy, the sister of the clan that wasn't too concerned with the traditional Gummy ways and just wanted to be a princess. And lastly, you have Tubby Gummy, the eldest of the three, voiced by Lorenzo Music. Yes, him again. This man was Garfield, Peter Venkman, and now he was a rotund, anthropomorphic bear that loved food. In other words, if a studio needed a voice for a character that was either lazy or snarky or both, Lorenzo Music was that guy to voice it. But the secret of the Gummies wouldn't remain that way for too long. The secret of their existence would be discovered by Gavin, a squire and page that accompanied King Gregor. He was the one that had the Gummy medallion, the key to open the great book of Gummy. He was also smitten by Princess Calla, whom herself knows of the Gummies' existence upon meeting Sunny. But things weren't all peachy keen in the kingdom of Dunwin. The Gummy Bears had to fend off the nefarious Duke Sigmund Igthorn, a former knight of King Gregor that was exiled for attempting to overthrow him. He commanded an army of not-so-intelligent ogres. Igthorn spent his days plotting to take over the kingdom in Castle Dregmore with his lackey, Toady in tow. Igthorn also spent his time thinking on how to capture the Gummy Bears so they can make him gummy berry juice to carry out his plan to dethrone King Gregor once and for all. The series was unlike anything seen at the time, and that was due to its animation. The series was handled by Walt Disney Animation Japan. This was their first outing under the supervision of Motoyoshi Tokunaga, who previously worked for TMS. Yes, the mighty Japanese studio Tokyo Movie Shinswa. The series format was comprised of a mixture of full-length episodes and 11-minute segmented episodes as well. That usually involved the Gummy Bears trying to evade Duke Igthorn and trying to stop him from taking over the kingdom. The Adventures of the Gummy Bears was a bona fide hit on NBC by the end of the 1985 season. It was one of NBC's top shows on the lineup and all of Saturday morning programming. So it was greenlit for a second season. This season brought on changes for the series, including adding another Gummy to the clan, Gusto Gummy, and his pet toucan, Artie Deco. Whereas the Wuzzles only lasted for 13 episodes, The Adventures of the Gummy Bears went for 4 seasons on NBC. But in its fifth season, it had changed to another network, ABC. It was now paired with Winnie the Pooh and packaged as the Gummy Bears Winnie the Pooh Hour. The Gummy Bears had been a success for Disney as it garnered merchandise such as official plush bears from Fisher-Price, books based on the series, comic strips, promotionals from Wendy's and Kellogg's. Disney even managed to make a ride based on the series at their Disneyland theme park called the Motorboat Cruise to Gummy Glen. The Gummy Bears were a bona fide hit, but their greatest contribution would be something that would catapult Disney television animation to greater heights. The Gummy Bears helped establish this. That's right, this. Its sixth season premiered here for 19 episodes. And that was it for the Gummy Bears in 1991. As for the Disney afternoon, this is definitely a story for another time indeed. In all, The Adventures of the Gummy Bears established an iconic studio's expansion into television. But the series was more than that. It may not be fondly remembered by many these days, but without its existence, Disney wouldn't have had the foothold that they still have in the animation space today. The success of Winnie the Pooh, DuckTales, and many others started here. All because of one man's vision to bolster a studio that was falling out of favor with the public. Speaking of Mike Eisner, this was only the beginning for him at Disney. He would go on to move the company in a direction that took Disney Animation Studios to the next level, and the company as a whole. Moving forward, we will see what came under his tenure. But for kids in the late 1980s, we had no idea that these lovable bears were going to be the start of something great. All we knew was that we could watch them bounce here, there, and everywhere. And you know why? That's because
they are the gummy bears. They are the gummy bears.
NBC had many more offerings for their lineup. Around the latter half of the decade, movie studios start to offer up their IPs so they can get the anime treatment. Usually, the platform for these offerings were regulated to syndication. Case in point, Rambo, The Force of Freedom. Yes, that Rambo. Sylvester Stallone's second iconic role. The first being Rocky Balboa, of course. Rambo, particularly Rambo 2 and 3, was steeped in 80s war conflict and violence. But this wouldn't stop Ruby Spears Enterprises from making this anime series. A series made solely to push a toy line, as many IPs did in the 80s, and to compete with the dominance that G.I. Joe had in syndication and in the toy market. Unfortunately, this would be a costly endeavor for Coleco, the toy company behind the production of the series and toy line. The series would cost $10 million to produce at the time. Even though it wasn't exactly a huge hit in syndication, the series would set a precedent for how the networks handled insurance policies moving forward. NBC would get an IP-driven anime series on the lineup. This wasn't just some average insurance policy they were unleashing on their lineup. This was based off a movie that was the 5th highest grossing film of 1984. A film only topped by the likes of Ghostbusters, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, Beverly Hills Cop, and Gremlins, all whom are considered classic films today. And so is this one. That's right, The Karate Kid. The story of a young teenage boy by the name of Daniel LaRusso, played by Ralph Macchio, a native of Newark, New Jersey that's transplanted to the Reseda neighborhood of Los Angeles after him and his widowed mother moved there seeking a better life. He soon befriends Mr. Miyagi, played by the late Pat Morita, who teaches him karate to fend off bullies that are making his life uneasy. He learns more than karate as he learns about life itself. So, how did they translate that into a Saturday morning cartoon? Well, this is it. This is what the children of America were given to watch on NBC's Saturday morning lineup. Brought to a young audience courtesy of Geek Entertainment and Saban Entertainment, a studio that had gradually moved up the ladder by producing music for Geek's various animated productions to producing their own. They would have many under their belt by the time Karate Kid arrived on air. As for the series itself, it took on a very different approach from the film. Now, Daniel-san and Mr. Miyagi, along with newcomer Tommy, were globe-trotting adventurers trying to retrieve a miniature magical shrine after it's stolen from a temple in Okinawa. Along the way, they encountered those who seek to impede their path, but also they helped those in need. The Karate Kid showed up on the lineup 3 months after The Karate Kid Part 3 had released in theaters. Unfortunately, just like the film, The Karate Kid wasn't a huge success on the lineup. It only lasted for its initial 13-episode run. But as you may know by now, this wasn't exactly doom and gloom for the franchise. Well, at least for 1989, it was. It wouldn't see the light of day on any Saturday morning lineup ever again. But the franchise wouldn't see another entry until 1994 with the next Karate Kid, with a new student by the name of Julie, played by a very young Hilary Swank. She takes tutelage under Mr. Miyagi when he comes for a military reunion in Boston and visits the widow of his former commander from his World War II days. The film wasn't a huge success at the box office, and the franchise faded away. Columbia decided to take another crack at it in 2010 with a reboot starring Jaden Smith and action kung fu movie legend Jackie Chan playing student and teacher respectively. This time the film took place in Beijing and told the story of Trey, who transported there with his mother, played by Taraji P. Henson. He soon encounters Mr. Han and learns kung fu to fend off bullies that are making his life uneasy. Despite the reboot being oddly named for obvious reasons, the film was very successful at the box office, earning a whopping $359 million. It became the most successful film in the franchise. Surprisingly though, Columbia didn't capitalize with anything outside of its initial theatrical release. It would take the studio 8 years to revisit the franchise with Cobra Kai. Starting its life on YouTube, the series focused on Johnny Lawrence, the antagonist from the first Karate Kid film, struggling in life many years after the events of the first film. Johnny finds a new purpose when he takes on a new protege and tries to revive Cobra Kai. With the series being a direct continuation of the original trilogy, Daniel-san also makes his return as a very successful car salesman and a family man, and tries to stop Johnny from reforming the dojo. The series was a huge success on the platform, and it later migrated to Netflix in its 3rd season, where it became a bigger success on the platform, earning not only many accolades such as several nominations for the actors and winning Best Action Series in 2023 at the Critics' Choice Super Awards, but also became one of the most streaming series ever on Netflix. If that wasn't enough, the franchise returned to the grand stage again in Karate Kid Legends in 2025, or depending on when you are watching this episode. So it's easy to assume that the legacy of Daniel-san is intact for many generations to come. But in 1989, the children of America had no clue about that. They just wanted to see where Daniel-san and Mr. Miyagi would go next on their short-lived quest. Let's cross our fingers that a new anime series is made one day. Well, maybe that's not a good idea. NBC Productions had also gotten into the business of crafting its own anime cartoons for its network. Case in point, on September 13th, 1986, the network premiered Kissy Fur on the lineup. This one starred the titular anthropomorphic bear and his dad Gus running away from the circus after his wife dies during a performance. They take up a life in the swamps and open a boat tour service transporting other animals downriver. Kissy Fur was brought to a Saturday morning audience courtesy of Phil Mendez. Now, if you aren't familiar with him, it may surprise you that he had a long history in animation prior to the creation of this series and after. He previously worked on Hong Kong Phooey for Hanna-Barbera. Speaking of them, Phil would also create another series on the network for them. This time, it was a collaboration with SEP International SA, the same studio responsible for 1984's Snorks and, of course, The Smurfs, ran by Freddie Von Nickendam. Whereas Kissy Fur had its premise played out in the depths of a swamp, Foo Fur was quite different as it starred the titular character, a blue, droopy-jawed bloodhound that took up residence at a mansion owned by his deceased previous owner. Accompanying him was his niece, Rocky Fencer, a bulldog named Louis, and his sheepdog girlfriend, Annabelle. And then there was a cocker spaniel by the name of Hazel and her husband, Fritz Carlos, a schnauzer. They all had to escape the advances of dog catchers and their arch enemy, Amelia Escrow. She wanted the property for herself so she could sell it off to a potential buyer. But Foo Fur and his friends weren't about to let her get her way and always managed to spoil her plans. Both Kissy Fur and Foo Fur were just good enough to get greenlit for a second season on the network, with both ending in 1987 and 1988 respectively. NBC didn't only have original anime series created for the lineup, they also managed to bring the success of their primetime schedule into Saturday mornings as well. As the network had done with bringing Mr. T to the network after his success as B.A. Baracus on the hit show A-Team and being in Rocky III, they would get an offering based on a primetime series that was poised for Saturday mornings. Well, they had gotten two. More on the other one later. Anyway, the first being Punky Brewster, a sitcom that was steeped in 80s family savviness as it centered around a little girl by the name of Punky that is abandoned by her parents and left to fend for herself. Punky, along with her dog, Brandon, who is named after Brandon Tartikoff himself, by the way, are taken in by Henry Warnemont, a budding photographer who lived in the same apartment building she did. He becomes their guardian in the process. Punky Brewster was about as lighthearted as it could be. This was due to the performance of his lead actress, a very young Soleil Moon Frye. Her precociousness enamored viewers, especially children who watched the show. So much, NBC would get tons of fan mail from kids across the country who adored the show. Despite this reception, Punky Brewster was canceled after its second season. Supposedly, this was due to both Punky Brewster and Silver Spoons not performing well against 60 Minutes on CBS, which inhabited the same time slot. But before that ever happened, this happened. Here it is, the Ruby Spears commissioned animated series. It's Punky Brewster. This was NBC's attempt to bring in the audience that wrote those fan letters. The series takes a very different approach from the sitcom as it includes a new character that makes it more fantastical. Its name is Glomer, a magical gopher from the land of Shondun. It always managed to get Punky, along with her friends Margot, Sherry, Alan, and Brandon, into some kind of adventure by whisking them off to some faraway place. The cast from the sitcom also reprised their roles for the anime series. The episodes were usually 2 11-minute segments, but when the series got renewed for a second season, the format was changed, as the new episodes were only comprised of one new segment and one from the previous season. The anime series wasn't particularly a monster hit on NBC's lineup, unfortunately, but it did turn out decently in the end for Punky Brewster and the anime series as well. After it was canceled on NBC at the end of its second season, Coca-Cola Productions was given the rights to the series to make new episodes and sell it as a syndicated package. The series had gotten a third and fourth season. As for the anime series, it was also repackaged as segments for another cartoon series, Geek Entertainment and Cluster Television's Maxi World in 1989. Punky Brewster would make her way back to television screens years later with Peacock's 2021 continuation of the original series of the same name. Following in the steps of her adoptive dad, Punky was now a professional photographer and a single mother to 3 kids. Sherry was also back with kids of her own. Unfortunately, the continuation was quite short-lived. It doesn't matter because in 1985, kids had gotten their fix of the lovable, precocious little girl who was the spokesgirl of their childhood. Punky Brewster was a product of his era, and it shall forever remain that way. NBC's second network show turned anime series was based on a sitcom that was more successful than Punky Brewster at the time. Whereas that series had failed to maintain its spot on the lineup, this one was poised to do what Punky Brewster couldn't do. So, what was this anime series that was guaranteed to have many kids of America tuning in to NBC's Saturday morning lineup during the latter half of the 1980s? Well, just take a look.
Teach us and the scout make us twin. You're the only one that can scratch our ears. Put us in stitches.
Here it is, everyone's favorite wisecracking alien of the 1980s. Sorry, E.T. Alf, in his very own animated series. To say that Alf was well known would be a huge understatement. Alf was a household name in the 1980s during its 4-season run on the network, but it was a huge hit with children in particular. Created by Paul Fusco, it centered on a space alien that crash-landed on Earth, particularly the garage of the Tanner family. Since his spacecraft was deemed inoperable, the Tanners let him stay in their house until he could fix it and help him evade the military trying to capture him. But with the anime series, a different approach was taken. Gone were the Tanner family. In were his own family, as the series was a prequel to the sitcom. It took place on his home planet of Melmac during his earlier years, where he was just known by his real name, Gordon Shumway. The series told the exploits of Gordon before Melmac ever exploded. In his previous life, living in the suburbs of East Velcro, he resided with his family, starting with his mother Flo, and his dad Bob, his brother Curtis, his little sister Augie, and his dog Neep. Alf also had friends, Rick and Skip, and even had a girlfriend, Rhonda. Alf was living the life on Melmac until he and his buddies were getting into some mishap or crazy situation, that is. The series had an unusual format that hadn't been seen in a Saturday morning cartoon. Every episode started with Alf in live action talking to the audience, relaying to them what his life was like on Melmac, mostly working for the Melmacian Orbit Guard, trying to foil the machinations of Larson Petty. from trying to conquer the planet himself. This always took the viewer into the episodes as he reflected on everything that happened in his days on Melmac while writing his memoir. Alf, the animated series, was brought to viewers by the same creators of the sitcom, Paul Fusco and Tom Patchett, with Paul voicing Alf, of course. But the true stars of the production were once again Geek Entertainment and Saban Productions. It's easy to assume that Alf was a hit on NBC's Saturday morning lineup. Why? Well, after the first season of Alf, not only did NBC greenlit a second season, but a spin-off of the anime series was also made its premiere on the lineup along with its second season in 1988. I introduce to you all Alf Tales. This spin-off could be mostly described as the cast doing extracurricular activities, as it had them reenacting popular fairy tales such as Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, and Jack and the Beanstalk in a play-like setting. But these weren't just some regular renditions of the classic fairy tales. These were played up to wacky results, such as Alf as a rock star prince in their rendition of Cinderella, and he wanted to marry a girl who had earth-shattering vocals. Both of the series would be combined to create Alf and Alf Tales Hour during the 88-89 season. Unfortunately, the inclusion of Alf Tales meant Alf the Anime series never got more episodes. This could be contributed to a huge amount of expenses NBC, along with both studios, would have to incur to create new episodes for both series, but truthfully, this was not the case. See, NBC was beginning to shift its focus around with its programming across the board, going into 1990. Yes, I will get to that proverbial elephant in the room in due time. As for Alf itself, this wasn't exactly the end for him after the anime series. The sitcom did get a huge syndicated run in September of 1990, and a stint as a talk show host with the very short-lived Alf's hit talk show in 2004. And the character would make its last appearance in animation in the cartoon All-Stars to the Rescue, which was a product of 1980s social guidance that steeped its way into 1990. That's a special that needs to be touched upon in the future. In all, Alf was the national treasure of the 1980s, and NBC closed out the decade with him anchoring their primetime schedule and, most importantly, their Saturday morning lineup. An example of how pure fun was prevalent on 80s television. This would carry into the 90s, but unfortunately, Alf wouldn't make that trek into the decade. But Alf had something that only a very few IPs of the era had, a presence in today's world of social media and streaming. You can catch an episode or two of the anime series and its spin-off on MeTV Tunes, and the sitcom lives forever on YouTube and Tubi. In other words, our favorite alien is still in a great place, in reruns. Thanks for the memories on Saturday mornings, Gordon. Despite the network really not having the strongest lineup in the latter half of the 80s, it did manage to churn out some decent tunes by 1989. Well, not quite. 1988 would have some of their most unsuccessful offerings in the channel's tenure on Saturday mornings. Let's take The Completely Mental Misadventures of Ed Grimley, another offering brought to audiences courtesy of SEP International and Hanna-Barbera, in collaboration with Cuckoo's Nest Studios. The series is based on a character created by Martin Short, who was an alumni of SCTV, Canada's take on Saturday Night Live. Believe it or not, there is another SCTV alum who ironically had gotten a Saturday morning cartoon series on NBC as well. We will get to that one very shortly. As for The Completely Mental Misadventures of Ed Grimley, the series was created out of the necessity of Martin Short wanting to create an animated series that could entertain his kids. And NBC needed something that could compete with Pee-wee's Playhouse. The result was a character who was, as the title of the show implied, a crazed man-child living with a goldfish and pet rat. The series did manage to offer up live action segments in between episodes, courtesy of Ed's favorite TV show, Count Floyd's Scary Stories, a vampire telling the most unscary stories ever. The character of Count Floyd is an example of how special the cast was, as he was played by Joe Flaherty, an alumni of SCTV, as was the rest of the cast. You had Catherine O'Hara voicing the role of Miss Malone and Andrea Martin voicing Deidre Freebus. Even late great comedian Jonathan Winters joined the fray, voicing various characters in the short-lived series, including Leo Freebus. And short-lived it was indeed, as the series only lasted 2 months into the 1988 fall season. Its failure to capture an audience was due to Pee-wee's Playhouse, as we know by now, was a monster hit on CBS's Saturday morning lineup, so nothing was stopping its momentum at the time. The writer's strike of 1988 also played a factor in the series not gaining traction, as it affected most shows at the time. The series would rerun until the fall 1989 season, when it was replaced by another animated series. Remember when I mentioned there was another SCTV alum who had gotten an animated series on the network just a short while ago? Well, this was that animated series. This alum would be the most famous of them all in his heyday. Wondering who he is? Well, check this out. That's right. The series presented here is none other than Camp Candy. No, this was not a series centered on a sugary confectionery. The candy in the title comes from its star, none other than the late great John Candy. What can be said about him? Well, many things, honestly. As mentioned, he was an alum of SCTV. He had gotten his start with the troupe. Before that, John wanted to play football when he grew up, but a knee injury derailed those plans. Instead, he got into acting, and one thing led to another. This led him to get his start with the troupe Second City in 1972, alongside the likes of Martin Short, as previously mentioned, and Eugene Levy, amongst others. John began to hone his acting skills by taking on meager roles in various Canadian television series, such as 1974's Canadian Broadcasting Channel series Dr. Zoink and the Zookins, and the 1973 comedic film Class of 44.
SCTV now begins its programming day.
But it would be in 1976 when he would get to showcase his comedic talents to a wider television audience with the introduction of SCTV to CBC. Alongside his comedic brethren, the show was a variety series that depicted them doing a version of a television station/network located in the fictional town of Melonville. It featured the cast members doing various spoofs of television show genres such as dramas, talk shows, a soap opera, and of course, considering the comedic talent on display, sitcoms. John was one of the most notable cast members, with his roles in the series that included a 3D horror movie director, Johnny LaRue, Dr. Tongue, and Melonville's very sketchy mayor, Tommy Shanks. Candy, along with his other castmates, propelled SCTV to massive ratings for CBC. They became so huge that they would eventually start to branch off doing different projects, mainly film. Starring in 1978, Harold Ramis, yes, that Harold Ramis, went on to script classic film comedies such as National Lampoon's Animal House, Meatballs, Caddyshack, Stripes, and of course, Ghostbusters. Speaking of Stripes, the film helped to propel John's career in film hugely. It opened to $6.1 million at the box office and went on to gross $85.2 million. John was now in good company and soon started to build up his resume with other comedic fare such as the Steven Spielberg World War II comedy 1941 in 1979 and a small role in the 80s film The Blues Brothers. Despite his success in these films, he still managed to come back to where he started from. But this time, it was on a new network, NBC. The show was SCTV Network 90. The series was a bona fide hit on the network and managed to compete with NBC's iconic variety series, Saturday Night Live. Unfortunately, it only lasted from 1981 to 1983. John's career would gain more traction as he went on to have roles that began to cement him as one of Hollywood's top comedic actors. Films such as 1984's Splash, which featured his now iconic scene of him playing racquetball, 1985's Brewster's Millions, and one of the most successful roles of his career, the 1986 John Hughes comedy classic, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. John found success playing opposite Steve Martin in the film. But little did many know, John was dealing with some very personal issues behind the scenes. He continued with the bad habits that he had picked up prior to his career and along the way. Nevertheless, his career continued to rise, starring in features such as 1988's The Great Outdoors, 1989's Harry Crumb, and he once again teamed up with John Hughes that same year with Uncle Buck, this time playing alongside a very young Macaulay Culkin. Speaking of 1989, John had a role that was going to take him to the next level. Little did he know, something was brewing for him courtesy of one individual by the name of Joel Andrick. So, who is Joel Andrick? Well, he was a man who had gotten his start working with Chaim Saban. As we know by now, he is the man who started Saban Entertainment, an operation that initially provided music to Geek Enterprises animated series. Joe had an idea that he was clamoring to get made. Well, he and his partner Ellen Levy, to be exact. Since he had proven himself to Chaim when he used to work for him on various shows, Chaim went to bat for him. He had a very good friendship with the vice president of children's programming for NBC at the time, Phyllis Tucker Vincent Jackson. Besides being the first Black American woman to ever hold that position at the network, she was also instrumental in getting every big NBC hit Saturday morning cartoon since 1982, including The Smurfs and Alvin and the Chipmunks. In other words, she was the woman who was in control of what went on NBC's Saturday morning lineup. So Joe and Emily pitched their series to her. Their idea was about a camp counselor who was a bumbling nice guy, sort of like John Candy. See, Joe and Emily's idea was based on a song that Joel loved as a kid called Hello Mother, Hello Father, a song sung by Alan Sherman, a song parodist, a song sung in a tune of the classic ballet Dance of the Hours from the opera La Gioconda. His rendition was inspired by his son's antics at summer camp and took the form of a letter his son had written to him. The song was a huge hit at the time, reaching number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 charts in 1963. So, how could something like this be made into an anime series? Well, during their pitch, Joe had mentioned the camp counselor was like John Candy. Phyllis loved the idea, but she had one request. If they could get John Candy to voice a role in it, she would purchase the series and put it on the network. So, unsurprisingly, Joel and Helen sought out John Candy's agents, and the rest is history. On September 9th, 1989, Camp Candy made its premiere on NBC's Saturday morning lineup. The series was brought to the viewing audience courtesy of Deke Entertainment and Frostback Productions. As for the premise of Camp Candy, well, it was as Joel and Ellen intended it to be. It was John Candy in animated form, voice and all, playing the role of a camp counselor. The series had John trying to guide a group of young campers at his financially struggling summer camp. Speaking of the campers, they were quite a unique bunch of kids. First, there was Robin, the black girl who had a genuine love of the wilderness and animals. And then there was Alex, the tomboy, Vanessa, the fashionista from a rich family, Rick, the boy who always found time to prank others, Binky, the youngest of the campers, and Iggy, the nerdy klutz scared of everything. Together, they did many activities under the supervision of John alongside Nurse Molly, the sweet and caring nurse who had feelings for John and vice versa. But John had more than wildlife to deal with, as he also had to fend off Rex DeForest III, a crooked businessman who owned the land that was leased to John. He always tried to get John and his campers kicked off the land and shut the camp down so he could build new property on it. But of course, in typical cartoon fashion, Rex and his henchman Chester ended up failing every time. According to co-creator Phil Harnage, John was very eager to do the animated series as he loved what the series represented to him. This was his chance to show a younger audience what he was passionate about: conservation of wildlife. That level of passion paid off as the series was consistently #1 in its time slot. Camp Candy was a bona fide hit that season, so much that it had gotten various merchandise and something most popular Saturday morning cartoons had gotten: comic books. John made himself a household name with the kids of America. The series had gotten a second season in 1990, and that was it. You may be thinking that the second season wasn't a success, but this wasn't the case. See, Camp Candy's cancellation came at the expense of another series that also premiered on the network in 1989. This series became a hot commodity by the end of the 1989-1990 season, an overnight success. We will get to it later on. Usually, a cancellation of a Saturday morning cartoon series was final and never to be seen ever again. But what most may not realize is that some of these Saturday morning cartoons were picked up for a syndicated package for reruns. These ran alongside most syndicated offerings. Case in point, Camp Candy had gotten this treatment. But to sweeten the pot, it was Saban Entertainment that took it upon themselves and created a third season for the syndicated market. John was brought back not to only voice his likeness, but also shot live footage for the opening and closing segments. These were shot on his ranch in Toronto. He wanted to show the audience how much he loved wildlife conservation and teach it to them, and he did just that with the end segments as he dispensed information about various wildlife. That was it for Camp Candy. The series had a total of 40 episodes. As for John Candy himself, he continued to appear in films, but he began to take on more serious roles, such as his role as Dean Andrews in Oliver Stone's 1991 classic film, JFK. He even came back to work with John Hughes again, the Chris Columbus directed 1990 holiday classic Home Alone, playing Gus Polinski, the head clarinet player for the Kenosha Kickers, a role that was entirely improvised by Candy himself and done as a favor for John Hughes, by the way. Only the Lonely as well, but his most successful role in his 90s tenure would come in 1993 with Cool Runnings. This time, he was a coach for a Jamaican bobsledding team trying to get a spot in the Olympics. The film was a huge hit in theaters, cementing his name even further. Speaking of Coach, he also became and owner of a football team. Well, co-owner of the Toronto Argonauts for the Canadian Football League. The team would go on to win the Grey Cup in 1991 under his supervision. John was winning in his life and career, but behind the scenes, things were getting bleak. See, John had a family history of heart attacks. His dad passed away from one years prior. Throughout his life, John struggled heavily with his weight. Even though it was that same weight that made him the characters he portrayed on screen, it was also a heavy burden on him. On top of that, he had developed an addiction to drugs earlier in his life, mostly brought upon the guilt of the death of John Belushi. Even though he had quit them, he still managed to smoke a pack of cigarettes a day and overeat. Unfortunately, this finally would catch up to him. While filming Wagons East in Durango, Mexico, John decided to make him and his crew a late-night dinner. This dinner would be his last. On March 4th, 1994, John passed away from a heart attack at the age of 43. I previously asked what could be said about John Candy. Well, that's easy. John was a flawed but great human being, a family man, a friend beloved by those who knew him, a man who wanted to be at his best. But most importantly, John was a man who always gave us his all on and off screen, always sharing his kindness with those he encountered. He shared his heart and his love of making us laugh. What we saw on screen, that's who he was in real life. That bumbling nice guy. That was John Candy. And on one Saturday morning in 1989, he showed the children of America how much he cared to educate us on something that he was deeply passionate about. He made sure his campers were ready for the world, no matter if they were black or white. He loved it all and lived life like it was always his last. He gave us his all until the very end because that's just who he was. John Franklin Candy. Maybe he's upstairs above the clouds teaching a new set of campers. Who knows? All we know is that he was a fixture in our childhoods, and for that, we thank him wholeheartedly. Thank you for the memories, John. Thanks.
Tell me! Makeup! Oh, dear. Oh, I was afraid that might happen. Winning the award went to her head.
I'm afraid it went to my head, too. What are you doing? Don't pull it, man. I'm doing the ring of a nose. Let me go. I don't like you. Oh.
NBC also had quite the unique offering for its Saturday morning lineup as well, an insurance policy, a very controversial one. So what could be more contentious than the likes of CBS's Mighty Mouse The New Adventures? Well, take a look at this offering.
Through time in his quest to conquer the future, he is pursued by Jamie Jarren. Jamie must team with her.
Here it is, another offering from Ruby Spears Enterprises for NBC's Saturday morning lineup. So you might be wondering what laser tag is. Well, it's something that got its start in the 1970s when the United States Army utilized the tech that allowed them to train soldiers in combat. A system dubbed MILES, which stood for Multiple Integrated Laser Engagement System, by the way. It was designed to train soldiers on what to expect on the battlefield by simulating being shot in combat. The system consisted of firearms emitting infrared lasers. As you can imagine, the technology was inspired by Star Wars, supposedly, but in reality the weapons were patterned after the phasers from Star Trek. Speaking of Star Trek, the tech was emulated of sorts and made to the public courtesy of the toy company South Bend and Mego with their toy phaser games, Star Trek electronic phaser guns, and Star Trek Super Phaser 2 Target Game, respectively. These toys per se were successful. While these toys were on the market, one man was thinking up a way that he could take this concept and release it on a grand scale. His name was George Carter III, and in 1982, he did just that. Inspired by the gun battles in Star Wars, he took a shot at this idea and opened up the Photon Laser Tag Center in Dallas, Texas. He named his game Photon, and it comprised of an arena that housed mazes, obstacles, and an observation deck. The establishment became a huge hit in the Dallas area. The game had become so popular, he decided to open up several locations across the country. But as with anything that grows in popularity, competition is never too far behind. This was the case when Worlds of Wonder, aka WOW, a company headed up by former employees of Atari after the video game crash of 1983, decided to toss their hat in the ring. They created their own laser tag game that could be played outside of an arena. It would be the creation of Paul Rago, the vice president of marketing and product development at the company. He would dub the product Laser Tag. Their version would differ from George Carter's version, as it comprised a chest harness that had a sensor on it and a gun dubbed the Lightstar pistol. Despite Photon releasing its own version for the general public, it was WOW's version that grew in popularity, and it was quite lucrative at retail at the time. As with any popular toy released in stores back in the 1980s, an anime series would soon follow. Laser Tag Academy made its premiere on NBC's Saturday morning lineup on September 13th, 1986. So how did Ruby Spears translate this creation into an animated series? Well, the premise was the series taking place in the year 2986, where crime is low, courtesy of the contributions of the Laser Tag Academy, keeping the peace. The main protagonist, 13-year-old Jamie Jaron, uncovers a scheme orchestrated by Professor Olanga, who revives Draxton Dreer, an evil scientist from suspended animation. Dreer decides to go back to the past, 1986 to be exact, so he can try to rule the world there and change the course of history. Jamie jumps into action and follows him back into the past. She teams up with her ancestors, Tom, Becky, and Nikki Jaron, to travel back and forth through time to stop Draxton from ruining history. It may have seemed that Laser Tag Academy was ripe for success on NBC's Saturday morning lineup, but this wouldn't be the case. This was the least of Ruby Spears and NBC's worries when it came to the series. The real issue came about after the season had ended. In April 1987, a group of college kids was playing laser tag at night on the grounds of an elementary school in San Bernardino, California. A passerby had seen their game and called the cops. A cop had came to investigate what was going on. What had escalated would forever stain the reputation of laser tag as a consumer product. One of the players, Leonard Falcon, had mistaken the cop for one of his colleagues playing the game, and the cop, not knowing that he was playing laser tag, fired and killed Leonard Falcon on the spot. This, of course, led to negative press for the device and caused WOW to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, coupled with the stock market crash of 1987. This stifled WOW from ever continuing to fund the series. Laser tag was no more. Well, at least for WOW and Photon. Laser tag made its comeback in 2004, and today it languishes as a niche novelty. As for the series, it's a product of circumstances beyond its control. A series that raises the question of what could have been if it had continued on NBC's Saturday morning lineup. But when it came to the lineup, it was just a series that came and went like the others, just to fill up a time slot. NBC wasn't done just yet in 1989. They had much more to give to their audience. This time, it was an anime series that defined a pastime like no other. A series that had massive potential to reach the audience more than any other animated series ever on a lineup. It was an insurance policy to beat all that had came before it. So, what was this animated series that was poised to gain massive adoration from the young audience watching? It's about time that I show you what it is.
Kevin, I thought I told you to clean up your room.
Here it is, NBC's addition to the lineup that they were banking on to be their next big hit. I present to you
Captain N, the Game Master.
a byproduct of a pastime that almost single-handedly dominated the entertainment scene in the 1980s and 90s. That pastime was the Nintendo Entertainment System, and that it sure was. By 1989, Nintendo was pretty much everywhere, whether it was in merchandising, such as collectible cards, and having their own cereal dubbed the Nintendo Cereal System, courtesy of Ralston in 1988, to later partnering with McDonald's to have toys adorning the image of their franchises in every Happy Meal. To put it frankly, Nintendo ruled the world. Not even Sega with their console, the Master System, and soon to be released Sega Genesis could stop the juggernaut that was Nintendo. The games sold so well up to that point that Nintendo had a monopoly, and for good reason. If your game was on Nintendo, it was most likely to sell the most units, especially the games that Nintendo themselves released at the time, including Super Mario Bros. 2, and later that year, their highly anticipated sequel to The Legend of Zelda, Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. Not only did these two games send many young gamers into a frenzy, but Nintendo also unleashed its biggest product of that year, the Nintendo Game Boy. Being the true successor to the Game & Watch devices and also having the same creator, Gunpei Yokoi, the handheld was an overnight success due to its pack-in game, Tetris. With the imminent release of the highly anticipated Super Mario Bros. 3 on the horizon, Nintendo was poised to continue its dominance in the video game market. As we know by now, Nintendo did just that, but in the context of 1989, they were just getting the ball rolling. More like a boulder down a very steep hill. That's how huge Nintendo was in 1989. As previously stated in the episode, Nintendo was making their presence in the animation space with the Super Mario Bros. Super Show in syndication, a live-action sitcom animation series hybrid that had star power behind it. The late Captain Lou Albano and the late Danny Wells played the roles of Mario and Luigi respectively, and voiced them as well. They also managed to give the young audience a Legend of Zelda cartoon thrown in the mix, only shown on Fridays.
Nice job, hero.
Hey, excuse me, princess.
But as we also know by now, this wasn't exactly Nintendo's first appearance in animation. That, of course, being the previously mentioned Saturday Supercade, which aired on CBS in the early half of the 1980s. Now, this was Nintendo's first time to fully get in on the Saturday morning cartoon bandwagon, just like CBS did before and ABC did with Hanna-Barbera's Pac-Man. Captain N, the Game Master, would make its premiere on NBC's Saturday morning lineup on September 9th, 1989. As the Super Mario Bros. Super Show was brought to audiences in syndication, Geek Entertainment was at the helm for this one as well. The studio was on a huge run in the latter half of the 1980s, so it was fitting for them to helm something as big as this for a company that was at the top of its game. No pun intended. As for the premise of the series itself, it stars Kevin Keene, the typical teenager of the era, who was the average Nintendo fan. He is transported to another world through his television screen, along with his dog, Duke. This setup may seem vaguely familiar, and for good reason. Deke previously created a series with a similar setup for NBC 5 years prior, that being Kid Video, which had a group of kids being transported to another dimension based on music, trying to find their way back home. This was a hybrid of music videos and animation. Captain N, the Game Master, differed as it had him traveling to Videoland, a kingdom that was governed by Princess Lana, and she sought out a hero due to a prophecy. Armed with the Zapper and a Nintendo control pad belt that was quite useful, Kevin was up for the task of being the hero Videoland needed. But Kevin wasn't alone on his quest. The creators of the series dug into their proverbial bag for its cast of characters. These would be characters from Nintendo's biggest hit titles at the time. First, there was Mega Man, who was just enjoying the immense success and critical acclaim that Mega Man 2 had gained in 1988. In turn, the game is considered one of the greatest games of all time, and kickstarted a franchise that saw its latest entry in 2018. Then, there was Simon Belmont, the protagonist of one of the biggest third-party titles that ever hit the console, that being Konami's Castlevania in 1986. Around this time, he would come back in the drastically different sequel, Castlevania II: Simon's Quest in 1987. And with its final game in the NES trilogy, Castlevania III: Dracula's Curse, being set to be released in late 1989, Simon being in this series was an absolute delight for any Nintendo fan to see. And lastly, we have Kid Icarus, whose self-titled game was one of Nintendo's huge efforts in the console's lifeline after its initial black box lineup. Together, they traveled through warp zones to different worlds, encountering many characters and villains from various Nintendo games. Mainly, the villains were the main baddie of the series, Mother Brain, voiced by Levi Stubbs, a man who was already a legend at this point, as he was the frontman for the legendary Motown Records group, the Four Tops. Then there was the Eggplant Wizard, a minor enemy or annoyance depending on who you asked, in Kid Icarus, King Hippo from Mike Tyson's Punch-Out!, and of course, you couldn't complete this group of villains without Dr. Wily, the main antagonist of the Mega Man games. Upon first glance, one could surmise that Captain N, the Game Master, wasn't only just an insurance policy, but also a 22-minute advert for Nintendo. But surprisingly, this wasn't the case for the latter. See, Nintendo had no direct involvement in the making of the series. Well, not entirely. Initially, the idea for the series started life when Randy Studdard, the editor of Nintendo Power at the time, created a character named Captain Nintendo for the publication. It depicted his hero by the name of Brett Randalls battling the evil machinations of Mother Brain. He had the power to bring characters and items from Nintendo games to life through the use of exploding microchips. It was a hit in the magazine, and Randy brought the idea to Nintendo of America so they could use him as a mascot for the company. But unfortunately, Nintendo of America had declined the idea. Meanwhile, Nintendo was already partnering with Deke to create a cartoon series for them. This concept ended up being called Buddy Boy, a concept that was the work of the head executive of Deke, Richard Reynes, and artist Phil Barlow. Initially, the idea for the series was based on Atari Games' 1984 classic, Paperboy. Considering that Atari was a competitor with Nintendo around this time, with the release of the Atari 7800. Nintendo didn't want Deke to have a cartoon based on an IP from a rival company representing them. Nintendo told them to go with an idea that was pitched to them. The result was replacing Buddy Boy with Captain Nintendo, now dubbed Captain N. The reason for the abbreviation in the name was that Nintendo decided to distance themselves from using the series as an advert disguised as a Saturday morning cartoon. In other words, there is no mention of Nintendo in the entire series. This was for a reason. See, around 1989, it was becoming less common to see animated series being used as adverts for toy lines. This was due to the strong effort of the ACT and other powers that be at work. As we know by now, the ACT was making waves in regulating how products were being presented in children's programming. An act was being worked on in Congress that would make this practice illegal and permanent. Everyone saw the writing on the wall, including Nintendo. This was also seen in the depiction of the characters in the series. For instance, Simon Belmont was quite different from the games, as he was a blonde, vain narcissist, always looking in his mirror, trying to compete with Kevin for Princess Lana's affection. Mega Man was now green instead of his iconic blue color, very short, and used the word mega in everything he said. And Kid Icarus wasn't only inaccurately named, as his name was Pit in the original game, but also depicted as a Cupid type of character. This inaccuracy came down to one reason. As mentioned, Nintendo had no active involvement in the creation of the series. In other words, Deke had to wing everything, as they never played a Nintendo game before, and Nintendo never provided the studio any kind of reference material. So it was all or nothing for them. Despite these inconsistencies presented in the series, Captain N the Game Master was a hit on NBC's Saturday morning lineup. But depending on who we ask today, this success could be seen as being attributed to the popularity of Nintendo at the time. Either way, the series would get a second season where it was paired with the Super Mario Bros. 3 anime series that made its premiere in 1990, and even a third season with shortened segments, a different animation team, and paired with the Super Mario World anime series in 1991. The series also managed to get its own comic book series from Valiant Comics. Usually when a Saturday morning cartoon was given the comic book treatment, it replicated its source material with little to no liberties. But this wasn't the case with Valiant's rendition of Captain N. The comic adopted a mature tone, focusing on Kevin and featuring fewer characters from the anime series, and introducing Samus Aran from Metroid as a recurring character. Unfortunately, it was short-lived, lasting only for 5 issues in total. As for the anime series itself, it managed to run for a total of 34 episodes. Looking back, one could think that Captain N the Game Master was forgettable or didn't live up to the brand that Deke made their series off of. But this doesn't matter, because Captain N the Game Master came out at a time when Saturday morning cartoons were starting to become more edgier, and Deke was about to usher in the 90s with a plethora of animated productions. Captain N the Game Master may be long forgotten by many, but it attempted to bring our favorite pastime from childhood to one Saturday morning. That alone stands for something. It was a product of its time that holds a place in the corner of the history of arguably the biggest game company of all time. Nintendo and its IPs still stand firm today as top contenders in the gaming landscape. But in 1989, they were just starting to become the household names that they ended up becoming. Whether Captain N the Game Master or Deke's other anime series based on Nintendo IPs played a part in its rise to prominence is a matter of opinion. What can be said is that this wasn't the end for video games making a presence in the animation space. Far from it, as we will see going into the 90s and beyond. Not too bad for a teenager with a zapper and a Nintendo control pad for a belt. As the decade closed, it seemed that the big three were in good standing in the ratings, but something was looming. Remember when I previously mentioned that Camp Candy was canceled at the expense of another series that was making waves? Well, this was the case indeed. See, the networks tended to present their Saturday morning offerings with an annual Saturday morning preview special before the fall season, as a showcase of sorts to get kids excited about what they were going to watch during the fall season. Well, NBC had its own Saturday morning preview special. It was dubbed Who Shrunk Saturday Mornings. This would be a very unusual special as these kids hosted it. They should look quite familiar as they are the cast of this. Here it is, Saved by the Bell, NBC's newest non-animated series at the time. The series itself made its premiere on NBC Saturday mornings on August 20th, 1989. Little did anyone know, these teenagers would forever change the face of Saturday morning programming and usher in its demise. We'll address that elephant in the room when we jump into the 90s. As for what was truly going on with the big three Saturday morning lineups, it was the usual, battling to see who had the best programming in all of television. By 1989, the network started to face even fiercer competition from the syndicated stations, with bona fide hits such as Disney's DuckTales and non-animated children's programming such as Viacom's kid game show Double Dare. The network struggled to keep up. This assessment was brought about courtesy of Nielsen Media, but was more commonly referred to as the Nielsen rating system. Ever wonder what the Nielsen rating system was and how it worked? Well, it was a system that used a panel of individuals, usually parents as in the case of children's programming, that used devices attached to their televisions to provide data on their home viewership. These ratings were usually broken down into various age groups to determine what shows were the most popular in households. This served a purpose. It allowed the advertisers to gauge what shows were good enough to pay the networks for their spot to advertise their products to their target audience. Even though the Nielsen rating system was widely inconsistent based on measuring how well a show did in households, and the fact that only a few households ever used the devices, it dictated what shows were going to stay on air or going to be canceled. The networks weren't particularly fond of the Nielsen rating system. They doubted its validity as it felt it underreported viewing habits. The system caused many advertisers to pull back on advertising their products on Saturday morning time slots. One executive at a sales firm doubted the process by stating that children between the ages of 2 and 5 didn't even know their names, let alone what button to push on the Nielsen boxes. He also stated that parents didn't accurately write down what their kids were watching daily and just wrote down educational shows such as Sesame Street to ease their guilty consciences. Whether this was true or not, the fact was that the networks continued to rely on the Nielsen rating system to gauge what was lucrative for them. This must be mentioned because by 1988, the syndicated stations were getting more weeklies, as they were called, than ever before. Around this time, networks started to offer up their previous offerings as syndicated packages to keep their audience engaged with them. This worked wonders for them as Alvin and the Chipmunks and Muppet Babies were huge hits in the syndicated market. But it would be 1989 that saw a drastic change in the cartoon landscape. See, many of the toy companies started to bow out of the cartoon business as their toy lines started to become less lucrative for them. On top of that, the weeklies started to bleed into the weekends as several offerings started to pop up on those days. This was a problem for the networks, but in truth, there were other factors that the networks had to worry about when it came to Saturday morning programming. This was only the beginning of it all. Little did anyone realize a new renaissance was about to hit the airwaves in 1990. A new era, a new status quo for children's programming that was going to change the entire spectrum. So, with that said,
Oh, bye-bye.